Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. This is well, it's again from the big list of suggestions that I got, slightly tailored, but somebody asked, and I've been asked many times in dribs and drabs, not necessarily a direct question, but I've been growing a while now. What are the biggest mistakes I've made, and what did I do about them, if anything could be done? You have to bear in mind some mistakes you make, hopefully once, and it's too late. Like, destruction follows or such like. Anyway, from my point of view, you have to go back to, there was a time when I had no grow room. There was a time when I didn't live here, and I lived in another place and was a working being. And that work took me away quite a bit, staying in hotels and stuff, and I'd be away for sometimes the whole week, but not normally more than 4 days, but sometimes literally the whole week. Now, I didn't have many orchids in those early days, and they would have been Phalaenopsis. I know I had a Sharry baby, because that was going round a garden centre with the kids when they were young to get stuff for the garden, and kept smelling this waft of chocolate. And Hannah had this idea that it might have been a chocolate fountain, and could we find it and have some? So anyway, we hunted down the fragrance, and it turned out to be, the Sharry baby. So that was promptly bought, and that was in the dining room in those days. In that other house where I lived, the dining room had windows, big patio door windows like on this place at one end, then a large window down the side and another large window up the other end, so it had light coming in from 3 directions. It was a very bright room, and most of my orchids were kept in there. And that was an old house. It was a stone built house. The window sills were, well, they were as big as these shelves. They were nearly 2 foot deep, and that was the width of the walls, about 2 foot. The windowsills were, so plenty of like windowsill shelf space, but unfortunately it did face virtually south, so some windowsills were out of order. That was a house in the countryside, so I was reluctant to have any shading on the windows, the net curtains that people have to stop people peering in. You just didn't bother in the countryside because there weren't many people around to peer in. And, at night you drew proper curtains sort of thing to keep the light and the heat in, all that sort of stuff. But in those days, I failed to make the mistake that most people make when they start out their collection of Phalaenopsis, which is where most people start. I think we'll agree that most people start with a few Phalaenopsis, or maybe even only one, before the bug kicks in, and that's it, you're hooked. But I had Phalaenopsis in the main with this Sharry baby, and the mistake that most people make is overwatering. They drown them. And in my mind, in those days, I didn't think of those orchids as orchids. I thought of them as houseplants. So they were lucky I was away a lot of the time, or I'd have probably drowned mine as well. So that's a big mistake that a lot of people make that I didn't, purely because of my lifestyle. Well, my working life, basically. So mine didn't get drowned. They did get a chance to dry right out. And I think I twigged in those days that a lot of the ones I bought were actually growing in bark. So they were already in a reasonable type of media. And I think if ever I repotted them, which certainly didn't happen often, I'd have replaced them with what they were already in. Because a lot of people make the mistake of potting them up in potting compost, because they think they're houseplants. So I didn't make the classic mistake at the beginning, but I have made some on the way. So let's get to this place then. So initially I was a windowsill grower when I came down here, and I had less orchids at first when I got down here because I rationalised, because I was moving house, I thought we don't want to take all these tatty plants, we'll just keep the good ones, so I chucked a few out. So I came down with some reasonable Phalaenopsis. I think the Sherry Baby had gone by then, I can't remember. But again, it was a matter of where, and the majority of them went here. I'm still utilising this place. Don't forget, this is southwest facing, and if you take away all the orchids in the grow room, this is a bright area. It's not so bright now because the shade, the sun, bright light coming in from here has got plants in the way, so it's more diffused. This was just a conservatory with no shade netting, so this was a bright area here. You could grow almost anything here, and then the kitchen windowsill as well. And I started venturing out. I know I got a cattleya, and I think I got another Oncidium intergeneric of some sort. Pretty blooms must have, that sort of thing. But the variety wasn't there. And I would suggest that had I not gone in for this place and stuck with windowsills and stuff, my variety wouldn't have happened. So I wouldn't have made the mistake of getting orchids that I couldn't grow in the home. Because we all know the one thing that is normally lacking in the home is humidity. You can deal with different light levels, you can add shading, move farther away from windows, choose north facing, lots of things you can do about lighting in the home. What a lot of people can't do in the home, especially if it's like an apartment type place, is cool. Yeah? Because you live there and you don't want to be walking around in your hat, coat and gloves, and scarf and all that. You don't want it, do you? You want to be comfortable. So you're limited by what you can grow. And I was limited in such a way, and at one point I set up a growing area in the north facing, or well, slightly northeast facing bedroom that I could turn the radiator off in, and I had a cool place, and I tried some Masdevallias and a couple of Restrepias, I think, but I tried growing cool, and I set up humidity trays and everything, and it failed miserably, and I never really knew why. So it was a mistake. And when you come to, and what did you do about it? Well, I stopped doing it. I stopped using that bedroom as a growing area. But I never really understood why. My temperatures were down. I had humidity trays. I never got any sun in through that window. I thought, what the hell went wrong? Now I can look back and say what probably went wrong was those humidity trays did not provide anywhere near enough humidity for the types of plants. And in addition to that, we had no airflow. We had no air movement at all. So that's probably why they did not grow well. I also think that the temperature wasn't that low. On reflection, this was an upstairs bedroom. I didn't keep the door shut. I don't like shut doors in a house. So the heat from the rest of the house would have still gone in that room, even though the radiator was off. The radiator had to go off because it was directly under the windowsill that I was using. So I'd have had hot rising air coming up to cool growing, plants that needed humidity. So the mistake really was choosing to grow in that area and choosing the wrong plants for that area, and getting their environment nowhere near good enough for those types of plants. This comes back to something I keep on saying, check your environment out and have a good think about it, and then put plants in it or grow plants in it that work, that you believe are going to have a good chance of surviving in that environment. And also, like I've said probably a few times now, is most people do it the other way around. Get the plants and then try and find somewhere that will suit them. And that can often be a big mistake, is failing to find a suitable place for them, So anyway, that was the growing area mistake. I eventually decided to convert this, and it took quite a while to get it anywhere near good enough to bring any plants in for a start. I did it in stages. I thought, well, it's too hot. So how do we reduce the heat? Now, I was not using much internet stuff then. It was mostly books, I suppose, in the early days. And I thought, well, we put shade netting on. That's what people do with greenhouses and things. We'll put some shade netting on. and it made a bit of difference, but it was still too hot. And I thought, well, it made a bit of difference. Let's put another layer on then. We'll have a double layer of shade netting, you know. But my thoughts were probably that the shade netting, you know, it comes in different grades, doesn't it? 50%, 60%, 70%. I don't think you can go much higher than that. It becomes a blackout curtain. But anyway, so I put a double layer on. Better, but still no good. It was still too hot out here. I wasn't worrying about getting too cold, because I was doing this at the early part of the year, sort of spring leading into summer. I was also working in those days, and I had to start work at 7:30. So, you know, it was difficult for me to monitor. Really, I was monitoring what was going on at weekends when I could be here during the heat of the day, the middle of the day, that sort of thing. And I had a minimum maximum thermometer in here, so when I got home after work, I could tell how hot it had been. It was not the same as being there and being in it. So anyway, we got the shade netting up, double layer. Still didn't work. And to cut a long story short, we ended up putting the inlet and the extractor fan in. And with the netting, with the shade netting, that did the job. And then obviously it was a dry atmosphere, totally dry atmosphere, which, you know, I then started getting humidifiers in here. And I eventually got it to the state where I was reasonably happy that the plants could come in. And at that particular time, the bubble wrap wouldn't have been up there. And I hadn't put any shade netting on the roof, because this roof is the polycarbonate stuff, and it's opaque, and it's a double skin. And in my little mind at the time, I thought, that'll be fine. And it wasn't fine. And I got the plants in over a weekend, and it was a dull weekend. And I went off to work Monday morning, which was the first bright day we'd had since I'd done this. And up here, this wire I don't think has changed since those early days. I'd hung a couple of cattleyas, and when I came back they were frazzled. They were burnt to bits, beyond recovery. I had to dump them. So I underestimated the amount of light that could come through that roof. And I had a look round, and damage had been done in quite a few places. I didn't have that many plants out here at that time, you know, probably only a couple of dozen at the most, but damage had been done. So we then had to take the plants out of here because it was a weekday and I couldn't go shopping and get some more shade netting for the roof. So the plants came in and went straight out again. So again, it was a mistake on the amount of light that would come in through that roof. And we've also done that again since. If you remember last year, I decided in my infinite wisdom to get the aluminium stripy shade netting, and I believed what I read and what I'd heard from others, because I hadn't used that shade netting before. I thought I'd only need one layer of that. Oh boy, was I wrong. So basically we started doing a slow process of actually getting too much light on my more light sensitive plants. Now these down here didn't get affected that much because they're shaded by other plants, but up on these top shelves were a lot of my oncidium and intergeneric types, and they all started to suffer. Some of them were even mounted and hung up, and they suffered as well. But because it didn't happen overnight, it was a gradual process. It wasn't me that noticed it, it was somebody else noticed it. And once it was pointed out to me, I realised, and I went straight out as soon as I could and put a second layer on and put it back how it was before. The only difference was, instead of 2 lots of green shade netting, it had the green shade netting followed by the aluminium stripy stuff. Yeah? So again, it was a mistake with light and underestimating the amount of light coming in. And quite honestly, the way I am now, I've had to put 2 layers on the roof, stripy stuff and green, and it's round the wrong way because I added the extra layer on. The green stuff's on the top, so the stripy stuff's not doing its thing this year, but I couldn't be bothered to take it all off to put the second layer on. However, these areas round here, the green stuff went on first and then the stripy stuff went on top, and that would work a hell of a lot better if I had a gap between the stripy stuff and the green stuff and the glass. It would work a lot better, both for keeping heat out and reducing light. But now this year, the fact that my Vandas are blooming, Cattleyas are blooming, including the Laelia purpurata earlier on, 2 layers of shade netting is not too much. If I can bloom the highlight orchids, then 2 layers is necessary, you know. So that we're all basically light related so far as mistakes are made. And I would imagine if I had a standalone greenhouse, I'd be in the same boat. It needs a lot of shading. And a fair bit of the logic behind that is the glass. You know, if things were in the open air, you know, with the breezes and all that sort of stuff, you might not need quite as much. But then, if the sun's going to get near them, you will. You know, it takes quite a bit of acclimatising for orchids to take any direct sun, even through 1 layer of shade netting. It's pushing it, you know. So light, major factor for me. And as soon as if ever you do that transition and you grow in the home, and then there comes a time where you've run out of windowsills. And, you know, there's nowhere for your pets to go because there's shelving and everything all over the place. You finally decide to get a dedicated grow space of some sort, like a greenhouse. You'll have a transition from growing in the home to growing in that space. And that's where a lot of mistakes will probably be made, because you try and carry on working the way you did before and it won't work. You're now in a totally different environment. So, you know, and a lot of it will be light issues, like too much, or in some cases, depending on where your grow space is, it might not be enough, you know. And again, if you've got trouble keeping the light levels down, then go for the highlight orchids. Get something that's going to be happy in those higher light levels, and don't go for the shade lovers. And if the thing's going to be in the sun all day long, you'll have a hell of a job keeping it cool, so don't go for the cool growers. But if you go for the warmer growers, and you live in an area like I do, it's going to get cold in the winter. You're going to start spending money, because heating's the thing that will cost you the most. Yeah? And it does. There isn't really a way of getting cheap heating, not to any great extent. You can take the chill off a place. I mean, you can get loads of black containers full of water, and I've seen it done and it works. You get a pump and a hose pipe, a really, really, really long hose pipe, and zigzag it across your roof, yeah, like that. Black, yeah, what does black do? Absorbs heat. And you slowly pump your water through that black hose, and it will come out the other end, not far off too hot to touch, providing it's long enough. So you get hot water in your containers in your grow space, and at night when the sun goes home, it'll give off that heat and it'll take the chill off. And apart from the electricity for the little pump, it's almost free. So that's a way of getting a bit of heating. But then you're taking up a large area, because there's no good doing it with a small amount of water. It won't work. You need quite large volumes of water to give off heat overnight. That's a way of getting a bit of free heat. But there aren't many ways of getting free heat. It's going to cost you money. So again, you know, if you make the mistake of getting all those luxurious tropical warm growing orchids and then find you can't afford the bills in the winter, and if you remember, we had an example of this, those of you who remember Oliver's greenhouse, I mean, I knew Oliver reasonably well. We'd met quite a few times. in person. Didn't actually live that far away from where I am. But he had to give up the whole lot because he couldn't afford to run his grow space. He couldn't afford the electricity that went into keeping that place right for his orchids. So he had to give it up and sell the whole lot off because he went into business on his own and he needed startup money. So there was a secondary reason. But he was finding the running costs too high. So don't, as an easy mistake to make, I haven't made it, but it's another easy mistake to make, is don't underestimate your running costs if you go to a dedicated growing area. There will be running costs. You'll need probably humidifiers, you'll need fans, you'll need a heater, yeah? And all of these things don't last forever. And some of them are not happy in your growing environment, like my fans. These aren't happy in here. These are not designed to be running at 80% humidity. They are electricity. So they don't last forever. You know, they get used. They get quite a bit of usage. So anyway, we seem to be doing mistakes that can be made rather than mistakes that I've made. So first of all, lighting. We made a bad mistake there and it lost me one of my best ever cattleyas, and I've never replaced it. And I can't think what the name is now. But if ever I see it again and the name triggers, I shall get it again. But yeah. I think the mistake I've made is getting potting media wrong, combined with, because it usually goes together, repotting at the wrong time. Now, I can say that I've done this, and unfortunately I can say that there are occasions when I still do it. And sometimes it's a bit of trial and error. And unfortunately it can be not as straightforward as it sounds. You know, you listen to, or you watch somebody do a repotting video and you think, oh, I've got that orchid and they've done it like that. Right, I'll do it like that then. And you fail to perhaps appreciate that their growing environment's totally different to yours. And media can often be defined by the type of environment it's geared up for. And some of my mistakes with media have been just that. I mean, I've now got a place that maintains good to high humidity. So it has a dramatic effect on how I pot certain things up. Now, if I go back 3 or 4 years out here, I couldn't keep my humidity up as well as I do now. I mean, it's Hurricane Hector's done the job there. It's that's more like an industrial unit compared with the little home units I had before. And if I couldn't keep my humidity up that well, you compensate by watering more often because your plants are going to dry faster in warmer weather. So as the heat rises, the plants transpire faster and lose moisture through evaporation and need to draw more in from the roots. And in warm weather, in lower humidity, that can happen quite quickly and you dry your pots out. Yeah? As soon as you bump your humidity up, that all slows down. And that's about the only time I can safely say that I've overwatered in some places. Sorry, let's rephrase it. I must never use that expression overwatering. There's no such thing. It's watering too often, not over. When you water a plant, you water it. None of this dribbling around nonsense. You soak the plant. What happens is doing it again before the plant's ready. Yeah, so it's watering too often, and I have done it, and it was most frequent, or it has happened most often, where I've selected a media that I've used before that worked okay, but my environment had changed and I hadn't appreciated it. Yeah, so there was a time where, due to the lack of humidity, I was heavy on the moss on some types of plants because they shouldn't dry out. You know, they're supposed to head towards dryness, but, you know, they shouldn't dry out sort of thing. So I put quite a lot of moss in the media. And it worked. And it worked pretty well over quite a few periods, quite a few years. But then it stopped working. and it was difficult to work out why. And it was basically because my humidity had dramatically gone up, and I wasn't using the water up in the pots, but I hadn't changed my watering frequency. Because once you start getting up into this number of plants, you will have a routine that adjusts through the seasons, yes, but it's still a routine. And I've got my sets of plants, and when I water those sets of plants, they got two choices. They either get watered in that run or they don't. And if they miss the run, they don't get looked at again until the next time I do that set. And that could be too long. Yeah? So, mistake, choice of media when the environment had changed. I'm basically using moss very, very minimally now. A change this year, it's a recent change. And I basically started using charcoal and perlite in with the bark to see how it goes. Now, there are some plants that are getting quite dry in between my watering runs that are in that media. But the problem is I've still got some that haven't been repotted with the moss in. So I've got a catch-22 now. I might even have to create a secondary set and have all the normal pots that have still got moss in them and all those that haven't, and do them on a different frequency. But that's starting to get complicated because they're not all in the same place. They're all over the place. But getting that watering frequency right is really geared up to not necessarily the plants you've got, it's what they're in will often dictate that. And some people, I think, probably grow all their plants in the same media. But that doesn't mean to say they will use up their moisture at the same rate. And a mistake I am currently making is doing those sets, because I know some of the plants are going to be too dry by the time I get to them. And I know some of them, not many nowadays, will get watered when they perhaps don't need to, and they ought to wait another couple of days. But I can't do it. So some will survive, some might not. Some will do better than others, I think is a better way of putting it. Now, to avoid those problems with media, we do that. And now you've got rid of all of your problems with media, because under virtually all circumstances, they're going to dry daily. So your frequency is already set by choosing to mount stuff. Now you can vary the amount of moss, yeah, from nothing to quite heavy, and that will dictate the frequency. And it can work, and you're unlikely to get root issues because you've got too much moss on a mount, because they're still not going to stay dry very long at all. I mean, even on dull weather, like the sun's come out recently, but it's been raining most of today, and I've had no temperature in here. It's still only 20, yeah? And that's with the door open to the house. When I came in here this morning, it was 15.9, so we dropped even below 16 last night. And it stayed like that most of the morning, so low temperatures. But even with those low temperatures, most of my mounts have dried. They were watered yesterday, later in the day, sort of lunchtime-ish. Some of them are still damp, and I could probably tell which ones are still damp. It'll be ones like that. Yeah, that's damp. That might be. No, that's dry. But when you get one like this, with hardly any moss at all, that's bone dry. But that doesn't matter. That can wait. The big twinkles up there are on a mound of moss. Yeah, a mountain of moss. They take 2 to 3 days to dry, unless it's very hot. But there are those that haven't got much moss that dry every single day, even in the winter. So your watering frequency is a mistake that a lot of people will make, and I make it myself, and I'm currently making it knowingly. But it's still a mistake. You know, if you want to grow your plants to perfection, what you grow them in and how often you water them, I haven't even got on to feed yet, will often dictate their health. Yeah? And like I've said, you know, if a plant's as fit as a butcher's dog, it's going to grow well, look good, and it'll bloom. So, a mistake that most people make is watering. And it's mainly frequency. It's very rarely the amount, it's just how often. And some plants are quite happy, cattleyas, to be totally dry in between watering. In fact, some of them actually need it. They grow better that way. So a mistake that could be made that I don't make, and I don't think I ever have, is those that need a wet-dry cycle is watering them before they're dry. Because you've just removed the wet-dry cycle, so don't do it. You know, if they're meant to have it, then make sure they do. And quite honestly, you won't do much harm if the period that they're dry is longer than it should be. It's better that way than watering before they're dry. So this is all watering now. Feeding mistakes. Quite honestly, if you feed low, you know, and keep your feed levels low and make sure there's a flush in there now and again, you're not going to go far wrong. But a mistake that people will make is using a garden fertilizer, and don't get me wrong, I've got no problem with garden fertilizers being used for orchids, providing you're measuring the strength, because they're designed to be used a lot stronger out in your garden for trees and bushes and stuff. You know, orchids are low feeders relative to, you know, to that sort of plant. So as long as it's adjusted to a level more suited for orchids, it'll be fine. But what's often wrong with the garden fertilizer is not what's in it, it's what's not in it. And a lot of the assumptions on garden fertilizers by the manufacturers are that you're going to use it with tap water, therefore the tap water has got calcium and magnesium in it. So they don't put any in. Well, not all tap water's got those in. Yeah? You can have incredibly soft water that's got very little of anything in it. You know, it's got a very low TDS level in, you know, we want to get into measurements. And that type of tap water is actually okay for orchids, you know. But you can't guarantee that tap water, first of all, the calcium it's going to have will be calcium carbonate that furs up your kettle and furs up the pipes. And that type of calcium is not readily absorbed by plants very well at all. So, you know, it may have calcium in it, might be quite hard water and furs up your kettle. But that doesn't mean to say it's got calcium that's suitable for your orchids. Your orchids will probably get some out of it, but you've got no control over how much. So, you know, as far as I'm concerned, mistakes made on feeding is using the wrong type of feed that hasn't got everything in it. You need those trace elements. They might look like silly little tiny amounts, but plants don't grow so good if they're not there. So you can make mistakes with feeding, but the mistake that most people are going to make that I don't make is feeding too high. Some orchids are sensitive to high levels of feed, and the roots will actually burn, and then their function stops. You know, they'll get brown stains all over them, and the ends will stop growing and they'll start dying back. You're actually killing your roots by the physical amount of feed that they're getting. And also, not flushing ever is likely to do that long term if your feed levels are high. If your feed levels are low, flushing becomes less important. And if your plants are really growing well, the chances are they're using up most of what you put in the pot, so you don't get the build-up. Yeah? So I go along nature's way and feed low and feed often, so I don't tend to get root burn and things like that. The only time I got root burn was when I was using the Kern's Rain mix, and that... You know, I don't say directly it was a problem with that feed. I was feeding at higher levels in those days, and the problems I got were burnt roots, but it only happened on mounted orchids where there were bare roots. And I think it was literally that the feed was staying on the roots in its raw form, without any form of dilution, and it was just drying on the roots fast. It wasn't getting a chance to be absorbed because the water was evaporating off so quick. And that's the only thing I could put it down to. I mean, loads of people use that very successfully. And I had problems on some plants, so I stopped using it. And others had the same problems with some burns on the roots. And things like a Phalaenopsis, where a lot of the roots start at the base of the plant, but they're not in the media, and they grow down into the media. People were getting burns on the bit that was above the media, but once the roots got down into the media, they were okay. So it only seemed to cause problems on bare roots, basically, in places where temperatures were quite high as well. That was another factor. And possibly lower humidity levels than were ideal. But yeah, so those are the sort of problems you can have with feeding. What else? Mistakes I've made. Well, you can go into the trying to grow things that are not ideally suited is classed as a mistake. You could say that virtually everything in here, in my environment, is a mistake. I'm only getting away with it because my humidity is high. Especially with things like Restrepias. I mean, they really are high humidity plants. My humidity is not high enough for them. They could do with higher, but I get away with it. I'm pushing boundaries. But these are the sort of mistakes you can make. Like, you go to, say you took a trip to Burnham's. I mean, you've seen my videos of their growing areas and the sort of plants they've got. They've got a huge selection of Restrepias, and they've got some lovely well-grown plants, as well as lots of smaller divisions for you to grow on, which is how mine started. And you might look at the blooms and think, oh, those blooms are gorgeous. I don't know whether I'll have to let go of the camera, and it might not focus, but I'm having to hold it sideways to get down where the blooms are. But the blooms are very, very attractive, albeit small. I've got some more over here, see if I can get some of them in shot. I suppose that's a bit dark down there. But you could easily be seduced by such plants with such nice blooms on, and you take them home and put them on your kitchen windowsill, and the sun comes out and frazzle. Too much light, not enough humidity. So, again, it's making mistakes on light levels. A common mistake with growing in the home is just not having enough light for certain plants. And you might have a lovely green plant and it grows incredibly well, and you're really impressed, and the plant's absolutely stunning, and it just won't bloom. And it hasn't got the light level required to bloom. And certainly some plants do need those high levels, or they'll grow well, but they won't bloom. Most Cattleyas are high light orchids, but some of the more complex hybrids will grow okay in light levels lower than you appreciate. Really, they will still bloom. They might not bloom quite as well, but certainly some of the Cattleya types, when you get into the species, and certainly some of the Lalias, they are highlight orchids, not bright, high. So getting the light level wrong, and I've done that. I've bought plants. I've been given plants as well. I've been told it's around the back there, I'm not going to get it down. My Ancelia africana is unlikely to bloom in the UK. Not many people bloom it, but some do. It's a highlight orchid, it's a treetop orchid. But I've been told if my Vandas bloom, then that one should. And my two Vandas do bloom. What else? Mistakes I've made. I've made personal mistakes that make me look an absolute idiot, but they're more verbal than anything. Like, first time I went to the Orchid Society garden party, and I thought, God, this guy must be an incredibly good orchid grower. He's growing Vandas in his trees, in his garden. I didn't realise they'd been hung up there for sale. You do feel a fool. But yeah, if we step back, I'm going to end on this because I could go on waffling for flipping ages around things that can go wrong. They're not necessarily things that have gone wrong for me, but a little bit of humour at the end. The biggest mistake I ever made was starting to grow orchids in the first place. And the second biggest mistake I ever made was getting a grow room to put them in. Because this is it now. I can't walk away. I'm stuck with it. Now, I love it. Now, things could change. Next year I might get fed up with all this because it ties me down. Can't go on holiday. Yeah? Although the cats tie me down that way as well. So there's a twofold sort of reason. But I'm sort of stuck here in the main. I can do day trips and 2, possibly 3-day trips with a little bit of help maybe. But it's tied me down. I'm tied to it. And if I get fed up with it and start getting sloppy with my water, oh, I can't be bothered to water today, I'll do it tomorrow. Some plants are going to start to suffer. So, you know, you could say the mistake in the first place is having this number of orchids. People keep saying, you said you weren't going to buy any orchids, but you keep buying them. I've got rid of more than have come in. My numbers are still going down, slowly but surely. Another 2 mounts went out yesterday, I believe. And they were 2 dendrobiums that lived up here. The rhodostictum's gone, and that was a project plant. So next time we do the project updates on the dendrobium types, there'll be one missing. And also there was another dendrobium up there, which was the mounted Dendrobium moniliforms that I was given as seedlings in pots, and they're just so badly infected with scale. They've stopped growing and they'd started dropping their leaves. The rhodostictum, I said, this is its last chance. It's pushing up a nice new growth. If that new growth is successful and opens its leaves, well, it didn't. They turned yellow and the growth failed. So those 2 went, you know. So we had 3 bought new plants here, and I ended up with 4. And I've thrown 5 mounts away recently. Yeah. This one's hanging on by the skin of its teeth, but we did say that there is a new growth at the base, and it does look like it's going to push on. And round the back of it is a tiny little new root. So that one might make it. And while it's trying, I'll give it a chance. But that's its last go now. If that new growth fails before it actually gets 2 leaves on the top of it, then that one will be out. So I'm being ruthless, and the number of orchids is slowly going down. Having just put an order in with Lynn for some plants from Schwerter. But again, several cattleyas have gone out during this year. And so I've got a couple more cattleyas. I won't say what they are till they get here. They won't be in bloom. We'll have to wait. But yeah. So having too many orchids is a mistake I've made. And the workload has got too much. And at times I've walked out here and looked at it and thought, I can't do this. And walked out again and left it for a day. Have a night's sleep. You know, have a nice meal, a glass of wine, watch a bit of telly, have a nice night's sleep, get up the next day, walk out in the same place, and it looks different. And suddenly it's, right, let's crack on and get this done. But don't underestimate the fact that too many orchids can wear you down. And it might not happen overnight, it could happen over years. And gradually the novelty wears off. And you start getting to the point where you begrudge what you're doing. And that's the point to change something. And the easiest option is to have far less. And you'd be surprised, once that trigger happens, once that mindset just flicks over, that switch goes, and you look at them and you think, why have I got so many orchids? Suddenly, you can find your favourites quite easily. which leaves those that aren't. You've already made your selection. Yeah. So there we go. And my big advice for anybody whose collection seems to be getting bigger and bigger, it's a very simple thing to say, but not an easy thing to do. Know when to stop. And I'll leave you with that thought. Thanks for dropping by. See, have I got any new blooms to look at? No, I haven't, have I? Well, only ones that have been bought in, and we've looked at them. I will just do a comparison. Lots of people have got this Thailand black that I've recently got, and now that my Phalaenopsis type is open, you can see why I keep the one that's mine. Look at the difference in the bloom size. This is an incredibly large Phalaenopsis type dendrobium with good shape and good colour. This is good colour and a good shape, but it's not a good size. They can grow a lot bigger than that, and that is one of the bigger ones. And I'll let you into what I think might be going on here. It'll be a flipping nuisance if it is. Look at bloom closely. Look at bloom closely. Look in pot. You see a gap through there? Because I do. And I suspect at repotting time we've got two plants. And not only have we got two plants, I think we've got two different clones in the pot. I don't mind, it's not a big deal. This is the one I bought, Red Velvet. And if this is one of the other clones, when it gets repotted, if it goes into two plants, it's not the end of the world. I like Nellie Islas. It's just that this one is my favourite because it's the most red out of all of them. So, but anyway, yes, it's worth noting that, you know, that this one's hung in there over many, many years, even though the plant's virtually failed several times, and I've just managed to keep it going, and the reason is the tessellations and the size. So sometimes we hang on to things when we shouldn't do, really, and then on reflection you realise why you did. And if you've got something like that in your collection that really floats your boat, whatever expression you want to use, it's special to you, might not be to anybody else, but they're the ones to put the effort in and really try to keep them going. And the also-rans, the run-of-the-mills, the ones that you might have bought 5 years ago and seemed like a good idea at the time, and the novelties worn off. If you need something to go, that's the area to look at. Yeah. Right. What's the time now? 3:30. Might be time to switch the old goggle box on and see what's going on in our wonderful Parliament, because there's not much comedy on in the afternoons apart from that. Oh, they do make you laugh sometimes and cry. Right, see you next time. Thanks for dropping by, listening to my waffle.